Welcome to another episode of Red and Black, where your conservatism is not just the color that you're used to. I'm Lenny McAllister, and let's jump right into it because we have a lot of serious things going on around the world over the last couple of weeks. And so, Dr. Metz, I'm going to jump to you first. I mean, usually we have a more lively and jovial open, but it's hard to laugh when we're seeing so much devastation going on in Ukraine, and we're seeing how the impacts, but it's having an international impact, not just in Europe, but we're starting to see a worldwide effect. And I'm going to start with you first and talk about what's going on there, but we're going to talk about it, everything from the boots on the ground there to the impact it's having here. But first, I want to start with you.
Yeah, well, so let's begin with what's going on the ground. Clearly, there are war crimes that have been committed. However, the ICC says they are investigating. The last time the ICC investigated Putin's war crimes, guess what? They said they had no jurisdiction. This is going to be the same thing. Now, keep in mind, uh, Russia withdrew from the ICC, so they have absolutely no jurisdiction over him whatsoever. And Ukraine is not a member of the ICC. Now, of course, what's going to happen is that there are people who are going to refer it, but at the end of the day, it's not going to make a difference. War Crimes Tribunal, he'll probably be dead by the time that actually takes place, so that's useless. And then you have the whole issue of, well, America should have boots on the ground. America can't have boots on the ground here. That is simply not acceptable. What interest does America have in having boots on the ground? America can't do that. That then, first of all, the president would have to get permission from Congress to do this. And then this is thrusting us into another war. Not to mention the impact on the economy. The Russian stock market has been closed forever. I mean, their money's worthless at this point. I hear the talk about sanctioning the oligarchs and all of that. I heard Lindsey Graham said, take him out. I've heard all of that. But, you know, at the end of the day, there is both a humanitarian crisis and war crimes being committed. And frankly, the US and its partners are powerless to stop it unless NATO decides that it wants to intervene, and that becomes a whole different issue.
Priscilla, I'm going to actually go to you with this. And I know people that are going to watch the show and that are chiming in on the chat room are going to have a fit because they're thinking I'm making this a partisan issue very quickly when I ask this question. But I'm going to ask you to answer it as the daughter of a military individual, somebody that served the country. And again, thank you, Dad, for his service. And I want you to think more geopolitically than partisanly, if you will. But I have made the case over the last several days that this war in 2022 really started in 2012 because you had Barack Obama who told Bashar al-Assad, here is this red line. You crossed it with the barrel bombings. There are going to be consequences to pay. Bashar al-Assad crossed that red line, and at the time, President Obama did nothing, forcing Vladimir Putin to be more of the intercessory to resolve the barrel bombing situation in Syria, which not only gave Russia a leg up on what was going on with the Syrian civil war and made the Nobel Peace Prize winning president look very weak when it came to holding a red line, but it also seemed to tell Putin that America will talk big and carry a soft stick. So when it came time for the Crimea, nothing was done. And now you saw this military buildup for months, nothing was done. And now you see the invasion. I make the case that this was 10 years in the making, not necessarily just 10 months in the making. What say you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, even maybe decades in the making since the fall of USSR. And thank you for bringing up the military. My father was a Vietnam War veteran. And when you grow up in the military community, you hate to see war. And there's no reason, like Dr. Metzler said, for America to be sending troops to Ukraine. They're not a member of NATO. You know, for us to think that it's our job to, I mean, people can make an argument whether it's our job to protect the potential threat to other NATO countries. But at the end of the day, this was a mistake, I think, on the fact of our president. And, you know, yeah, there is an economic impact, where people are questioning, why are we continuing to even buy fuel from Russia while we're sanctioning them? So there are a lot of things are watching the news where it doesn't make sense for why we're there. What's our purpose? Are we going to keep changing where the line is and our threats to Russia when they've just attacked a nuclear plant in Ukraine? I mean, it's just falling apart. And the American people are even questioning the validity of the news. And so I think it's going to be really crucial for our military to decide what the plan is going to be. We don't want to broadcast what the plan is to everybody, but we need to have a really strong strategic plan about how we're going to involve our young men and women who have signed up to protect our country, because there's a lot of things, there are a lot of attacks. And I hope we're prepared for whatever attacks Russia might have on us should our sanctions go sideways.
Jeff Charles, this is now, and you can make the case that every American president kind of goes through this, but Bill Clinton didn't necessarily go through this. Since Bill Clinton, every American president came into the presidency expecting to be one thing, and something went completely sideways to make their presidency pretty early on something different. George W. Bush, I'm going to be the compassionate conservative, and then 9/11 happened. Barack Obama was going to be post-partisan until the stock market collapsed and we went through the Great Recession. Donald Trump was going to bring us and usher us into prosperity, and then the pandemic happened. And now we're seeing Joe Biden, who we've all talked about previously. You know, hey, there were questions about if he would be okay at the State of the Union this past week. He's gone from I'm here to heal the nation and bring some stability and get us back out of the pandemic to now he's on the brink of World War III in a very real sense. You know, how should Americans look at President Joe Biden when just literally 2.5 years ago, he wasn't even the prime candidate of the Democratic Party? He kind of was like the guy that kind of lasted through the rounds the best, that they kind of settled on. And now he's the guy representing the Western world when it comes to this threat coming from Russia.
Yeah, I think you're right, Lenny. And I, you know, every president signs up for this job, and they always think it's going to be different from what it's actually going to be, because there's no way to predict what's going to happen. But you brought it back to Obama and the whole red line with Bashar al-Assad. I want to bring up also when President Obama was sitting with then Russian President Dmitry Medvedev and said that after the 2012 election, he would have more leverage to essentially give in to what Russia wanted when it came to missile defense. Now, he said that to Dmitry Medvedev. He was really saying it to Putin, who has been in power this whole time, even when he didn't hold that position. So there was Obama giving in to him, but it didn't even start with him. If you remember, under George W. Bush, he said that during his meeting with Putin, he looked into his soul and that he felt like he could trust Putin. He said, I would have invited him to my ranch if I didn't feel like I could trust him. So Putin has done a very good job of manipulating American presidents, and that is one of several reasons why we find ourselves in the position that we're in today. A lot of people have been bringing up the fact that Putin didn't try any of the stuff under Trump. And there could be a lot of different reasons for that, but Trump was unpredictable. He wasn't afraid to be bellicose. And he said a lot of nice things about Putin, but you always knew that with Trump, there could be that hard stick. So I think that's also figuring into this as well. But really, again, there's so much here, but one of the other issues is, why are we not energy independent? You're right. Why are we placing sanctions on Russia, but we're still going to buy our fuel from them? It makes absolutely no sense. This is why we need to be energy independent, which people like Joe Biden and Obama don't want us to be, but it's for situations just like this. No country should ever have this amount of leverage over us. No, we don't need to be sending troops in. I'm not advocating for that. But again, we do need to at least be paying close attention to the situation, because if it doesn't resolve itself soon, people are speculating that Putin could try to push this further. I don't know how far he'll push it, because I know he doesn't want war with us. At the same time, if he feels like he can get one over on us because we have a weak leader, why wouldn't he try more?
So let's talk about the oil part for just a second, then we'll get into the other aspects of the geopolitical chess pieces that are maneuvering on the table. Russian oil is about 2 to 3% of all the total imports that we take in. So I know that there's a bipartisan bill right now that's being considered that it's by Murkowski up in Alaska and Manchin in West Virginia to, in essence, shut off all Russian imports. It's only 2% of the oil, so it's not going to really impact America that much. It's really Europe that is over leveraged on Russian oil, which is what brings this whole American reliance, NATO, and then the Western powers in Western Europe coming into play with this battle. Because number one, they're the ones that if the spigot turns off in Russia, they're going to have a problem when it comes to gas. And number two, they've seen this play out before. You have, particularly in World War II, Dr. Metzler, where you have one country say, we just need a little bit of that country because our people there ethnically live there and we're just trying to liberate them and protect them. And then slowly but surely, somebody gets a thirst for power. And the next thing you know, you got multiple countries at war with other multiple countries and hundreds of thousands of young people die. And that seems to be less of where America is, but more of where your Germany, particularly Germany.
Yeah.
Germany and a few other Western nations are really looking at this and saying, can't believe we're at this point in time again.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, Germany, and keep in mind, Germany has a very young chancellor. He just came into the job and he's somewhat reticent on the international stage. So you've got that issue. This also shows the collapse of the so-called humanitarian human rights issues. Linda Thomas Greenfield, the ambassador, really, every time you turn around, you're calling an emergency meeting and yelling at Russia. I believe that every time you yell, Putin is shaking in his boots. I mean, come on. You see the UN having all of these human rights hearings and condemning Russia, doing all of these kinds of things. And what's the result? Nothing. They have no power. So here's the question. Russia is engaged in war, and they're engaged probably in genocide and a number of other crimes. So why are they still the chair of the Security Council? Again, what this tells you is how useless these organizations are. And it is the total collapse. You've got the UN saying, oh, there is a major humanitarian crisis. Yeah, water's wet. What are you doing about it? They don't have the power to do anything. And so, people said, Trump said, well, you should withdraw from NATO. Well, I'm not sure he was wrong. Because in this case, what exactly is NATO doing? NATO is doing nothing. And here's the other part I don't understand. They're sending all these missiles, whatever it is that they're sending. Yeah, you might want to have sent those a long time ago. How are you going to get them in? Obviously through some clandestine operations, but you're going to send me stuff to do what after my country is destroyed? It doesn't make any sense.
But that kind of goes back to this too. And Priscilla, I'll go back to you and then guys jump in. Dr. Metzler brings up when the missiles should have gone in. One could make the case that Joe Biden could have sent the missiles in before we got to this point in time in 2022. One could make the case that missiles should have gone in the moment that they annexed Crimea.
Yes.
Almost a decade ago, because you saw a thirst by Vladimir Putin to take advantage of the political winds in America with a waning President Obama who's going up against a Republican Congress and Senate. He takes over an area. There's not an appetite for Americans to go to war over a small piece of territory in southern Ukraine, particularly at a time, and people forget about these things, Priscilla, and this all matters, right? America's been ripping itself apart over the last 10 years over race issues. I mean, Trayvon Martin was 2012. Ferguson was 2014. Freddie Gray was 2015. The 2016 election was 2016. I mean, just those 5 or so years that I named right then and there was plenty to preoccupy a lame duck president that was both trying to avoid race during year one and trying to interject himself a whole lot in race in year two, not working out well. there wasn't an appetite to deal with Crimea then, especially when the Greek economy was collapsing 10 years ago as well. Yeah. And the opportunity was missed to bolster Ukraine after a big loss, because it was the first time that a sovereign nation had lost territory in a long time. The last time somebody tried that, it was a little country that started with the letter K. You may have heard about it. It's called Kuwait. Mm-hmm. And what did that trigger in 1991? Mm-hmm. Priscilla, maybe we missed the opportunity, maybe not 10 years ago, as far as, the Syrian civil war, but even 8 years ago, 2014, 2015, over the Crimean crisis.
No, I mean, there's definitely an argument to say we've been highly distracted in America with social justice issues, and maybe even getting comfortable in the wealth that was being built in our country, that we weren't so concerned about what was happening in other countries. And I know I was, cautiously optimistic when the United States sent Kamala to Germany, thinking, well, maybe possibly there will be the same type of situation where Germany and the United States could talk to Russia and talk them out of some sort of attack on Ukraine. That didn't happen. And now we're all questioning, like, what is she doing in other countries in Europe and at the borders of Ukraine, when we again have our own border issues here. So there's a lot of mass confusion, a lot of opinions about what we're going to do and how we're going to handle it, because now we're there, now we're involved, and how we proceed or potentially come out of Ukraine at this point, it's going to have to be really well thought out, because we don't want to have this stigma of going into a country and exacerbating a war or withdrawing. Like, Afghanistan is fresh on people's minds, like how we left that war-torn country. And so it's going to be really crucial to get the smartest heads in a room together to talk about the repercussions of every decision we make, because yes, we are dependent on other countries for oil. I mean, gas went up overnight, 40 to 60 cents in a lot of places, and it hasn't stopped. I mean, we're going to see fuel costs go up. And after watching the president's State of the Union speech, and I was really perplexed when he said, just reduce your costs. And I'm thinking, how are Americans going to reduce their costs when they're at the mercy of inflation, at the mercy of other people deciding how much fuel we're going to have, how much groceries we're going to have? Like, all of these decisions are out of our control. And so these are compounding issues that we're seeing based on, the decisions that we're making, that you're right, we could have prevented had we really taken seriously what happened in the USSR. And I don't think Putin is going to stop at Ukraine. I think he has bigger ambitions about reuniting and growing his, I'm not sure what he would call it, but he's just definitely trying to gain that power back.
And Jeff, you could see how serious the tone of the show is this week, because Dr. Metzler's drinking out of a mug. It's probably coffee and not wine for once.
I noticed that.
So that tells everybody in the chat room and everybody watching Red and Black this week that we're for real. But let's take it to what Priscilla said in regards to the impact on the American economy. Now, I know the jobs numbers came out on Friday and said that we added over 600,000 jobs. We're almost back to the pre-pandemic jobs market. And that's great in that regard. And we're having more people come into their job market. That's great as well. But she also brings up the fact that inflation has gone up a lot, the most in 40 years. And when you couple that with gas prices, people forget that the cost of fuel goes into everything. They gotta drive your eggs from the heartland to you on the East Coast or on the West Coast. They have to make sure that milk gets to you. They have to make sure that bread gets to you, even if it's across town, from the bakery across town. You got to put gas or fuel or diesel in that truck to ship it across town. We won't even get into the heating costs, where even in the northern part of the country, you still got about 2 more weeks of some cold weather to deal with. We won't get into the fact that if people are actually going more into the economy, they have to get there some type of way. More and more businesses are opening up, and the CDC just recently took down many of their mask mandates, which means what? People are going back into the office to work at a time where all the costs are going up because fuel costs are going up. We're already seeing that if Putin's plan was to squeeze the world even while he's shelling Ukraine, you can see the squeeze here in America at a time, by the way, where the American society is still not unified. This is an issue that has people upset, but it's still a disjointed society because of COVID, because of inflation, because of elections and everything else.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. And I don't know if Putin's playing chess master right now, but if he is, he's doing a very good job. And I don't think that people understand how bad this is going to get. I mean, people are already going to be hurting when they go to the pump to fill up their cars. But you're right, Lenny. Fuel impacts prices on everything. I used to be in the food service industry. I used to be a salesperson for a food distributor that sold food to restaurants. And I remember last time something like this happened, when gas prices went up, everything went up. That means that a lot of these small businesses, these small restaurants, are going to have to jack up their prices. Even the bigger chains are going to have to do the same thing. Some may end up going out of business if this situation persists, and it's going to have a huge impact. And I didn't even mention the other industries. So I mean, this is going to be yet another issue that places the Democrats in danger. It's going to, if it persists, if it keeps going, it's going to take them in the House, in the Senate in November. And it can even impact them in 2024 when it comes to who owns the White House. So the ramifications on this are already severe for the Democrats, and they were already in a bad situation before this. So it'll be interesting to see how this whole thing turns out, because, I mean, to Priscilla's point, we don't know when Putin's going to stop. I don't know how this whole thing is going to pan out. I think that there has been some blowback that Putin didn't expect. So it could turn out that maybe he relents for a bit, because he is getting more resistance than he originally thought. There were allegedly 3 attempts on Zelensky's life, the Ukrainian president, and those were foiled because of people in the Russian government who fed them information because they don't want to go to war. So there's also that side of it too. Putin may seem like he's getting what he wants, but this could actually turn out a whole different way, with Putin maybe taking an L here. So I think we also have to think about that as well.
What are you thinking, Dr. Metzler?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think Jeff's 100% right on that. And I think as we're talking about prices, et cetera, remember, the Fed is about to do some significant interest rate changes. So you have to figure that in. They're looking at issues of inflation without having figured that in. So there's that. There are those components of it. And, look, as the only person here who's taught at the Russian Presidential Academy, let me tell you that when it
Did you really have to throw that card out there on us? Everybody already knows that.
But I'm just...
Wait a minute. No. Jeff, hurry up and stop blowing your nose so I can bring it back on camera. You don't get to... You do not get to throw that out there, Mr. Know-It-All. We already know you've done everything in the world.
Well,
so,
I'm just saying, just so people don't think I'm just talking.
You already know. It's on the disclaimer at the bottom of the screen before we start every show, like an infomercial.
Yeah, what I didn't say is that Dr. Metzler is actually the one who warned Zelensky about those tweets.
Thank you, Kira.
I was going to keep that on the low, but now that it's out in the open, we might as well talk about it.
We might as well say it. But if you look at the universities and the institutions there, you have a lot of students who really are pushing back against what Putin is doing internally. That's where you're getting the protests from on the streets of Russia. And understand, the people are like, oh yeah, they're just protesting, but you don't understand how severe that is. When they're arrested, you have no idea what will happen to them if you ever see them again. You just don't know that. But they are, in fact, the students from that university in particular are actively involved in a number of protests.
What do we make of the whole Putin is not as stable as he used to be? Because I understand, look, my 2 cents is I can understand why they would say that. the COVID isolation can make people a little funny. If you had COVID, it can mess with your brain chemistry and you can have brain fog and yada, yada, yada. I'm less inclined to believe that. And I'm going to start with you, Priscilla, and anybody jump in when they want to. I'm less inclined to believe that than I am to believe that this dude is smart. He's a KBG agent that studies geopolitical affairs and has done it his whole life. He does not have much of a conscience. He's all about wins and losses in a very objective way. And he's been paying attention to the last 15 years. He hasn't had an American president that was willing to really stand up and go to war over something, honestly, since Bush 41. Clinton got caught up in his own affairs and had the 90s to ride off on. George W. Bush had 9/11 and then got misdirected on Osama bin Laden. President Obama, even though he was droning a lot of people, did not take on Putin. Trump buddied up to him. And now you got Biden, who everybody kind of says, his best days are behind him. You know, I'm more inclined to believe that Putin said, if I'm going to roll the dice now, I better do it now or I'm never going to roll these dice.
I mean, I think that's the theory because, you know, he's not a spring chicken anymore. This is his opportunity to show. I mean, this is something he's been thirsting after, to be a world power and to reunite all of these countries back again under his leadership. And so I think he sees a perfect opportunity because let's just be honest that Joe Biden is not considered a strong leader. He's not considered a strong president. And when you look at a brand new young president or a leader in Ukraine whose, you know, life was not in politics. He was a comedian and an actor. And so what are his relationships politically across the globe? And so I think you're right that this is, he's in perfect striking zone. And he's proving his bravado, if you will, and he's obviously succeeding because in a matter of days, he's been able to instill a lot of damage in the Ukraine, and I think now the rest of the world is starting to pay attention because maybe the thought was the NATO countries and the United States would come in and do something to block or use sanctions and have conversations with someone like Putin. Putin's been planning this. I don't think he feels threatened at all by anything that we say because we're not. I do try to watch the White House press briefings every day, and I'm not hearing anything coming from Jen Psaki that would make me shake. You know, if I were Putin coming out of her mouth about what we're going to do. So something really needs to be done because I think Putin is serious, and I don't think he's going to stop.
Jeff, are we entering the new era of detente with Russia where more of the American people, maybe even the American government, would rather just play to a safe stalemate and allow Russia to have some of these wins than go to a Reagan, Bush 41 type of understanding of Russia, which is we win and they lose?
Yeah, it's tough to say. I mean, part of me thinks that at some point, this is going to come to a head. It could happen next year. It could happen 10 years from now. But at some point, Putin's going to happen again. There's going to have to be a line that Putin can't cross. And Putin is shrewd. He is smart. And he kind of knows where to push that line and when to pull back. So I'm not saying that this is going to end up with war with Russia, because as much as we don't want to go to war with Russia, they sure as hell don't want to go to war with us either, because that won't end for them well either. So I think this will get to a point to where there is a sort of like a stalemate or some type of equilibrium where Putin at least gets enough of what he wants to where he's not going to keep pushing, because he's going to want to avoid having us breathe down his neck. All we need is to have the right guy in office. Biden won't be president forever. And Democrats won't be in office forever either. Most likely, in 2024, we're going to elect a Republican president. I don't know if that'll be Trump or somebody else, but it's not going to be somebody who's going to kowtow to Russia the way that Biden, Obama, and yes, even Bush did. Because I think we're ready for something else. So I don't know how that's going to turn out. But even when it comes to the stories about whether Putin is mentally well enough, that actually speaks to another important point, Lenny, because what we haven't talked about yet is the news stories that are coming out and whether we can believe them or not. we do have a lot of misinformation going on about this whole situation. We've got propaganda that's pro-Ukraine, anti-Ukraine, pro-Putin, anti-Putin. I mean, you heard the story about the whole Snake Island fiasco, where these Ukrainian soldiers had allegedly held off Russian forces. It turns out that at least some of that is a fiction. It could be that the whole story is a fiction, and we don't know. It's to the point to where I'm hesitant to share any stories on Twitter about this conflict because I don't know if they're fake or not, or if they're being exaggerated. And we saw the same thing happen in the lead up to the first Gulf War. You know, the whole thing with Iraqis going in and killing children in incubators and stuff like that. Turns out it didn't happen. We have been lied into war many times based on deliberate misinformation. Even the Spanish-American War, we were led into that based on misinformation. So I think we also have to be careful in what we're being told, because our government has an agenda, the activist media has an agenda, Putin has an agenda, and yes, Zelensky has an agenda too. And we can, and regardless of what side we line up on, I mean, obviously most of us aren't too fond of Putin. We have to be, as citizens, we have to be very careful about the news media that we are consuming, because if not, we can get manipulated into something that we don't want any part of. Yeah, we're all about saying, yeah, we don't want to send troops now, but they find it so they can manipulate us pretty easily. So we have to be vigilant about what we're consuming and take everything with a grain of salt.
Mm-hmm. I want to add on to what Jeff was saying as well. And like, this is a perfect time, the teacher in me, and I'm sure Dr. Metzler, to go back and really study history and watch some documentaries about what happened, because even in the 80s and prior to that region, so that we can better understand what's happening and why is it. It's not like all of a sudden out of nowhere Putin is attacking Ukraine. There's a reason, there's an agenda, and he has a plan. And if we don't know our history, then it might be confusing. And then to have to sift through, to Jeff's argument about what's being told to us in the media, you can start to kind of pick out what maybe is misleading information a little bit better.
Dr. Metzler, I'm going to talking about being informed citizens. I'm going to throw something out there as a cautionary tale, and I want you to chime in, and the other two can chime in as well, which is, over the last 20 years, elections around the world have become truly popularity contests. Mm-hmm. California went through some stuff with the Terminator as governor. Right. Minnesota went through some stuff with the protester as governor. America went through a pandemic with the host of The Apprentice as the president, who at one point in time told us that the virus was just going to disappear and go away. And now Ukraine is being attacked by the largest, as far as number of weapons, nuclear power in the world, with a former comedian who played the part of the Ukrainian president, now actually being the Ukrainian president. Maybe all of these instances over the last couple of years are some cautionary tales of, don't just elect a person that looks like they fit into the role. Maybe you need to elect some people that are going to actually do the civic duties to keep you safe while in the role. And that may include somebody that doesn't look photogenic, but they have a wart on their nose, but they've been involved in politics for 40 years. Or maybe we're not electing the rogue person, Marjorie Taylor Greene, that sounds really cool at a Tea Party, but is a hot mess once you get them into Congress.
Yeah, and I think in this in part goes back to what Priscilla said, which is making sure that we have informed voters. I mean, that's a part of the discussion. And as it relates to the Biden administration, there are a couple of things that stand out for me. Number one, Biden's been through this before. Had he learned nothing, or did he forget what he learned? If anything, that's
is that a trick question? Never mind. Go ahead.
Number two, I just have to, I don't understand, why is Kamala going back? Why? What is the point of that?
Actually, let me talk about that. Does that not seem to be risky to put the American vice president on the ground? I know Romania, and I know where she's going to go in Poland, is not that close to the battleground. But I mean, man, if I wanted to saber rattle, I would do something close enough to that area to make a point. Now, granted, I understand you go to another sovereign country and you do something. Now you really do possibly trigger a world war. But look, they got rogue insurgents everywhere. That you can saber rattle with to signal a point to the American people and the American presidency with her going to the region.
Yeah, no, I agree. And then the other thing I would say relative to Putin is this. He's got to pay attention to, does he really want to occupy? Let's take Ukraine as an example. Does he really want to occupy that when the people who are there are so fundamentally against him? It's one thing to blow everything up and install a puppet government. It's another to actually run the government when at any point you can have Molotov cocktails thrown at you. You can have suicide bombing. So, he's got to consider that as well. But again, that there has to be that line, as Jeff said. There is no line. So how much of Europe is he going to take over?
And that's interesting, because let's talk about that for just a second, because Dr. Metzler, you bring up a very interesting point. There's taking over, there's occupying. There's, tumbling and then installing a puppet government that you have to take care of. And if he's really trying to reconstitute the old Soviet Union in the 21st century, there's one oversight problem that's there, which is this. The technology of the 21st century allows a different type of rebellion and resistance, where now the world is a lot smaller than it used to be. You could literally draw the Berlin Wall and hide a whole empire behind a wall that's dividing a country in Germany.
Yeah.
You can't do that anymore between all the technology and everything else. I mean, you look at what's going on in China. And yes, China's done it in a lot of regards, but people forget that China is a second world country, not a first world country. And huge swaths of China is still extremely rural and poor. And there's 1 billion people there. You take a country like Ukraine and some of what you're seeing across Europe, both Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and there are different advantages that you have in urban warfare to be rebellious than you might have in Tibet, than you might have in certain rural parts of China, you might even have in Taiwan.
Yeah, and so speaking of China, I mean, part of the reason that I think it's important for that line to be drawn, keep in mind, China is watching this very carefully. And if he gets away with this, then they're going to go into Taiwan. It is crystal clear to me that that's what's going to happen. So there's that aspect of it, which folks are just not paying a whole lot of attention to.
So then this goes back to your point, Jeff. You talked about where's the line. Dr. Metzler now brings up a point. What line should we be looking at? Maybe it's not Putin's line. Maybe it's China's line. Because again, Russia, you can kind of mess with the oil, and the oil is going to impact Europe. But the economy of China and another nuclear power, brand new game geopolitically and geoeconomically, if China now crosses a line while we're looking at Putin crossing lines.
Yeah, I'm going to sound like a neocon right now, but the bottom line is America, who I don't know which president's going to do it, we are going to have to figure out exactly where that line is and be ready to act if they cross that line. I don't like saying this. I don't want to get involved militarily, but at some point there's going to have to be a line that whether it's China or Russia is going to cross, and we decide to do what we need to do. Now, I don't know, that line could be very, very far from what they're doing right now. Hopefully it is. But at some point, there is a point that they can get to where it's actually going to start threatening us or our interests or our allies' interests in a way that's going to affect the American people. And I don't know if that's going to happen next year or 10 years. I mean, the American public does not have the stomach for war right now. It doesn't mean that we never will again. And that's why these situations are so important, that we pay attention and have the right leadership in charge so that they can communicate that and say, hey, Russia, China, we don't like what you're doing, but here's the line. Here's where you don't cross. This is where you don't want to F around and find out. And then if they do, we have to be willing to back that up. And I hate saying that, but that it does need to be said.
Well, yeah, and I think.
Go ahead, Dr. Messer.
Well, I think we should start paying attention to what our leaders are saying, what language they're using, to see whether, in fact, they are preparing us for war. And I think we have to be we have to pay attention to that language, because I think that language is going to come, and we really need to pay attention to that.
But I think it's more than the language, and Priscilla, I'm going to get to you in just a second. It's also going back to what we talked about in regards to what stories are you seeing on the news?
Yeah.
What are we talking? I mean, right now we're being bombarded by one network talking about cancer patients that are children in basements of hospitals that are being shelled. Why are we hearing those stories? Yes, part of it's human interest story, part of it's obviously very tragic, obviously, and I'm not trying to underplay that. But strategically, you can talk about military offenses and maneuvering, or you can talk about kids with brain cancer being shelled in a basement. If you're trying to manipulate emotions, you don't talk about military maneuvers. You talk about children with brain cancer being, bunkered away in basements. Why? To try to turn the tide in regards to what's the appetite for getting more involved in this. So to your point, Dr. Metzler, sometimes the language that we have to hear from our leaders is unspoken language.
Yeah.
And it's more dare I say it in a different context, virtue signaling more than anything else.
Yeah, I'm going to throw this in there. I'm just going to throw this in there real quick. But yeah, you are very right, Lenny. It is very possible that they could be priming us right now using that. That's a persuasion technique. You prime somebody for what you're going to do later on. It's very possible that they could be priming us for some stuff that they know is going to take place in a few years. So we do have to be very careful, because they've done this with other wars. They could be doing it now. There's a documentary by Mike Cernovich called Hoaxed. If you haven't watched it, you need to watch that, because then you will see how they start planting the seeds one by one by one. I'm not saying that they're definitely doing it here, but they could be. So as Americans, we need to be aware of this.
Priscilla, let's go back to one of the points that we were talking about before, as far as the appetite to get into war. Barack Obama started his presidency in 2009, basically going on an apology tour across the Middle East and saying, man, we've been really, really poor in this region, and basically mea culpa. And hey, Ahmadinejad from Iran, if you want to talk, let's talk. And then Ahmadinejad just kind of, get away from me, kid. And then Trump literally was kind of like, we should get out of NATO. They need to pay their bills. He kind of cozied up with Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Even during the beginning of the pandemic, kind of gave Xi Jinping the benefit of the doubt with the pandemic, and we learned that they didn't deserve the benefit of the doubt. And he kind of said, I believe Putin, when our intelligence said that he wasn't quite telling the truth. On top of that, we've seen Republicans such as Rand Paul run for the presidency and testify as a senator on platforms of, that's not our war, that's none of our business, stay home. We see Democrats say, why are we spending money on big military when we should be spending it domestically? We've had this appetite to get away from this stuff for a while, when over the past 100 years, America was the force for good. Some would call it the policeman of the world. But we seem to be at a point of time that kind of almost defends or proves okay, this is why America has to be in this role. Because if you have a vacuum here, these type of things eventually play out. Are we at that crossroads again where we're going to have to sit there and say, okay, well, crap, we had to do this in World War II, and we had to do this in the Cold War, and we had to do this in the Gulf War, and daggone, here we go again.
Yeah, I mean, you're asking all of the right questions, and I think I'm hearing the same conversation with so many people on social media. Like, what are we doing, and why are we repeating history, and what have we learned? And I listened to a lot of America First rhetoric at the president's speech the other night, and he's changing his slogan from "Build Back Better" to "Make America" or make a better America or something like that. It's like, oh, now he's starting to become more America first, but there's no trust there. And as Americans are looking around at what's happening in the economy and things falling apart and the lack of trust, they're having to decide how they're going to protect their families against what could come, because I don't trust the government to make sure I'm okay should we go to war. And so we're looking at our bank account, we're looking at food supplies, we're looking at all kinds of things to prepare, because we literally just can't trust the government because the government is unstable. And so I think this is a really critical time for this administration, because we have 3 more years with them. And that's a long time to look at what's been done in only 1 year and to see where we are right now. How can Americans trust that we're going to be safe and we're not going to get ourselves into an unnecessary war? And we proclaim ourselves to be the guardians of democracy and freedom when we have our own issues here that have not been solved. And so, you know, when you don't have trust in your own government, we really don't have any business trying to tell any other country how to live free and to stand up for themselves. But I will say, you know, we are in a different time. Decades ago, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have the World Wide Web. People are watching citizens from other countries stand up for their individual freedoms. And so I think Putin is going to probably, and has been experiencing, the people of Ukraine stand up for their freedoms and their rights. And we'll see that in China. Hopefully we'll see that, you know, we've got North Korea and South Korea, like we were talking about Taiwan. These people know what it means to be free in these countries in Taiwan and South Korea. And so I think we just need to make sure that if we're going to go out there and try to proclaim freedom and democracy and all of this stuff, that we're actually demonstrating that in our own country.
But and that kind of goes to the whole interesting aspect of all this, which is, and I'm just going to throw it out to all of you. If America's been the global leader, but has never been perfect, does that erode away our ability to stand up for those values and make sure the world is set on a path to go towards a greater good? Because you can make the argument that America was not the country that should have been talking about saving democracy in World War I when they were lynching black folks. Strange Fruit came out during World War I and soon after. You know, America should not have been standing up against, you know, fascism and against, you know, discrimination and genocide against the Jews in World War II, when you had genocide against black people and apartheid here in America during World War II and afterwards. You know, so just because we're not perfect does not mean that we can't kind of strap ourselves up and take that stance once again, or does it? Because ever since the Vietnam War, Dr. Metzler, and we tried to fight that war against the Soviet Union and the communists while we were going through internal strife, we haven't quite been the same as a country when it comes to let's all to get together and stand against the common cause. The Cold War was fought without firing bullets. That was fought with technology and economics. You know, the Gulf War was a joke in 1991. That didn't last very long. The 2003 invasion of Iraq to get rid of Saddam Hussein was also a joke. You go to Afghanistan, and it looks an awful lot like Vietnam, and maybe that's also what Putin is counting on as well.
Yeah, no, I don't. Look, America's not perfect. We know that. However, the issue is not that we're not perfect, but we lack strong, cohesive leadership. That's the issue. And part of the reason we lack that is because we have too many uninformed voters. We have too many people who simply want to toe party lines and talking points rather than actually analyze the issue. Our elections in some cases have become who can be the most outrageous, who can say the most outrageous things. And you know, those folks keep grifting. And while they're grifting, America is losing its moral center. And I think we have to look at that. That is a conversation that we need to have. But we're not having that conversation. And I hear people saying, well, who's going to be better, the Democrat or the Republican? That's not my concern. My concern is, who is going to lead the country. That's the concern. But in order to know that, I have to be informed. I have to know what the issues are. I have to know how they impact me and the rest of the world. We have just become too lazy of a society where social media rules our lives. And because it's on social media, it's true.
It feels like we've gotten even lazier too. I mean, especially, when I was politically active, when I first started getting into politics, we were kind of lazy then, but I think it's getting worse. I mean, it is dangerous. We have to make sure that the people that we're putting into office actually have our best interests at hand, especially when it comes to war, especially when it comes to unnecessary war. I fear that what's going to happen, and I hope that I'm wrong, but I fear that what's going to happen in the future, like when it comes to war, the American public is going to be like, we're going to be quoting Michael Corleone in Godfather 3.
Yeah.
Just when I thought we were out, they pulled us back in.
Yeah.
And the thing is, if we don't pay attention, that is exactly what's going to happen, because we do have people in our country in very high positions of power that would love a war with Russia, or that would love a war with China, or maybe even both, or maybe another country. And this speaks to every single issue. We are just not as aware of what's going on. We think that people are fighting for us just because they say clever things to attack the left with. That's not fighting. That's performing. There's a difference. Right. I get we need our political theater or whatever, but we need to stop hiring performance artists and hire people who can do what needs to be done. When it comes to war, I don't care if it's Democrat or Republican. I want the one who's not going to get us into a war that we don't need to be in. We're sending our sons and daughters out to die. Like, that's a serious decision. And we can't afford to be voting for somebody or supporting somebody based on how they look on camera or how clever they are when they're owning the libs or owning the cons, because it's not just our side that does that, it's the left too.
Yes.
So I think we need an awakening in this country about politics. It doesn't mean that everything's going to be solved, but at least we can make sure that we're electing serious people who are actually up to handling these jobs that we place them in.
You do realize, and Priscilla just dropped off, unfortunately, you do realize that the irony of you saying we can't continue to elect performers is the fact that the guy that hosted The Apprentice was our last president, and Zelensky is now the president of a country under attack. So, and I'm, they had to handle very serious situations between the pandemic, the North Korean crisis at one point in time, even though it was short-lived, and now, of course, the invasion of the Russians of Ukraine. As we wrap up the show, and hopefully Priscilla be able to come back before we take off, one final question for you both. We've seen a lot of shocking things over the last period of time with what's going on with Ukraine. We come back on this show next week. What will absolutely shock you other than nuclear war? I mean, that obviously would be shocking. But Jeff, to you first, very quickly, what thing would be absolutely shocking if we came back next week and we said, I can't believe this happened over there?
At this point, it's very hard to surprise me because anything can happen. I would say if Putin gives up.
Yeah.
I mean, I know he's making inroads into the country. I've been seeing news reports about that.
Yeah.
But it just becomes too much for him to handle, and it becomes too much of a headache for him, and he decides to try to get out in a way that allows him to save face. I would be surprised. And I would be surprised not just because it happened, but because it would happen a week from today. I think it's a possibility, but I think if it does happen, it's going to take longer.
Yeah, I mean, the most surprising thing for me is if there were a rebellion inside Russia and there was a coup d'etat. That would be the most surprising thing to me if that happened. I doubt it, but you never know.
What's the most likely thing that you think will happen over the course of next week, Jeff?
I think that Putin will conquer more of Ukraine. And honestly, I don't know how much more time Zelensky has. I mean, I hope he's still able to avoid those attacks. Maybe they'll even stop trying to assassinate him, but I'm not very hopeful because Putin, the bottom line is Putin knows that we're not going to stop him. And he knows that another thing that would shock me is if NATO actually stood up and actually tried to stop him militarily. But he knows that's not going to happen. So I think it's going to continue on. I don't know if there will be any major developments, but I do expect him to take more land and more territory.
Yeah, I think it. Yeah, I think
think
it's pretty much going to be more of the same. I think that's pretty much, we're going to keep hearing the 24/7 coverage, and the people in the bunker, the former Miss Ukraine who was taking up arms. This really reminds me a lot of Baghdad Bob on all sides. That is how strong the propaganda is here on all sides.
Priscilla, what do you think is going to be most likely to happen over the course of the next 7 days before we come back next week?
I think what we're going to see is Putin double down with his attacks. I think that he's going to, I think I heard that the president of Ukraine has fled the country. I'm not sure if that's true or not. So that potentially opens the door for him to go into more areas without that much pushback. And so I'm just concerned that he might have more success in claiming some more areas in Ukraine.
Well, listen, folks, I appreciate your feedback. I appreciate all those of you that have been in the chat room, that have been joining us, whether it's during the premiere on Saturday or throughout the weekend. Again, share the link, share Red and Black. We are glad to always have conversations with you. Make sure that you subscribe. Absolutely. Make sure you also check out all the different projects that each one of the folks here on Red and Black are involved in. We're going to be following these breaking geopolitical events as it impacts our economy and impacts our country here and what we do here, but also our global neighbors across the globe. So in the meanwhile, you take care of yourselves, keep the world in prayer, keep your family close, and we'll talk to you next week. TCNGB. Take care and God bless.
See ya.